At my grandson's wedding, I noticed my name tag said, "The old man funding it all." That one small piece of paper told me more about my family than 68 years of living ever had. I've always believed weddings should be celebrations of love and connection, moments when family gathers to honor something pure. My grandson Ethan's wedding was supposed to be just that. I'd written the checks without complaint, reserved the ballroom, even covered the open bar, because I wanted it to be perfect. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror of my hotel suite, adjusting my tie. My reflection stared back, deep lines carved by time, silver hair neatly combed, and a suit my late wife Margaret had once called too handsome for a funeral. She'd been gone 3 years now, cancer taking her quietly in her sleep. I could almost hear her voice teasing me about fussing with my tie too long. "You clean up well, Thomas," she'd say, with that small smile that softened everything. I smiled at the memory and straightened my jacket before heading to the St. Andrew's Chapel, where Ethan and his fiancée Lily were to be married. The ceremony was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through stained glass as Lily walked down the aisle, and Ethan looked like a man seeing a miracle. For a brief moment, I felt peace. It wasn't until the reception that things changed. The grand ballroom of the Ashbury Hotel gleamed with chandeliers and laughter. I approached the guest check-in table, where a young woman with a clipboard smiled brightly. "Mr. Hall, right? Here's your name tag." I glanced down, expecting Thomas Hall, grandfather of the groom, but instead an elegant script with the words, "The old man funding it all." For a second, I thought it was a joke, maybe an accident. My hand froze midair. "Is everything okay, sir?" the girl asked, noticing my hesitation. "Fine," I said quietly, forcing a smile. I didn't want to make a scene. Just not what I expected. I pinned the tag to my lapel anyway, feeling the sting of humiliation. Who had written that? Ethan? My son David? His wife Claire? As I walked toward the main hall, laughter and music filled the air, but behind every cheer and champagne glass, I could feel something else. A truth Margaret had once warned me about. "Thomas, generosity is a gift, but to the wrong people, it becomes permission." And that night, I began to understand what she meant. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, but all I could feel was the cold weight of that name tag on my chest. Every laugh, every glass clinking in the distance seemed to echo the words printed there. The old man funding it all. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone thought it was funny. Maybe it was just a mix-up. But as I made my way through the crowd, polite smiles began to feel like smirks. At the bar, a pair of younger guests whispered nearby. Not quietly enough. "Did you see his tag?" One of them chuckled. "Yeah," the other replied. "Guess he's their personal ATM." I felt the words hit like stones. Then I saw David, my eldest son, waving me over to a cluster of people. His grin was too wide, too rehearsed. "Dad, come meet the Andersons, Ethan's in-laws. You remember Greg Anderson, right? He and I went golfing last summer." I nodded politely, extending a hand to Greg and his wife. But before I could even speak, David added with a laugh, "This is my father, or as we like to call him, our walking checkbook." The couple's smiles faltered. Greg muttered an awkward greeting, and his wife looked anywhere but at me. I forced a laugh, the kind you use when you've run out of pride. When they finally walked away, I turned to David. What the hell was that supposed to mean? He blinked, surprised by my tone. "Oh, come on, Dad. Don't be so uptight. It's just a joke. Everyone knows you're the one footing the bill." "A joke," I said quietly. "At my expense?" "Lighten up," he said, rolling his eyes. "It's a party." Before I could answer, Claire, my daughter-in-law, appeared, flawless in her designer gown, holding a champagne flute like royalty. "Thomas," she said brightly, "David's just been bragging about how generous you've been. We want everyone to know who made this beautiful night possible." They both laughed. I didn't. I excused myself before my voice could betray me, slipping into the restroom. My reflection stared back in the mirror. Same suit, same face, but something inside me had shifted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was how they saw me now. Not as a father, Not as family, just the old man who pays for everything. And as I stood there under the humming fluorescent lights, I felt the first crack in the illusion I called family for far too long. I was drying my hands when the restroom door opened and a familiar voice spoke softly. "Mr. Hall? Thomas Hall?" I turned. Standing in the doorway was Martin Reeves, my late wife Margaret's attorney, a kind, sharp-eyed man who had handled our affairs for decades. "Martin?" I said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He stepped inside, lowering his voice. "I was invited by your son. He wanted me to witness the family toast later." He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward my name tag, though now I see that might not have been wise. I gave a dry laugh. "You noticed it too, huh?" "I did," he said gravely, "and I don't find it funny." Margaret wouldn't have either. Hearing her name caught me off guard. For a moment, the noise of the reception faded behind a pounding in my ears. Martin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. "Thomas, Margaret left something with me before she passed. A codicil to her will. She told me to give it to you only if I ever believed you were being disrespected by family." My breath caught. What kind of codicil? She called it her final safeguard. He handed me the envelope. She was worried this might happen. "I'll let you read it." With trembling hands, I opened the seal. The handwriting was hers, neat, deliberate, the same script she used to leave notes on the fridge. "My dear Thomas, if you are reading this, then the people we raised together have forgotten the difference between love and dependence. Any descendant who publicly humiliates you, manipulates you for money, or treats you as less than the man you are, shall be disinherited from the portion of our estate I left them. I trusted you to decide when that time has come. With all my love, Margaret." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I swallowed hard, closing the letter. Martin spoke quietly. She made sure it was legally binding. "It overrides everything else." I stared at him, stunned. "Why didn't she tell me?" "She wanted them to treat you right because they loved you," Martin said, "not because they feared losing their inheritance." I looked at the reflection in the mirror again. Not just the old man funding it all, but the man my wife had trusted to stand up for himself when kindness stopped being enough. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my jacket pocket. "Thank you, Martin," I said, my voice steady now. "Don't tell anyone about this yet. Let's see just how far they'll go." As I walked back into the ballroom, I no longer felt humiliated. I felt ready. The next morning, sunlight leaked through the kitchen blinds, slicing the room into sharp stripes of gold and shadow. I sat alone at the table, still in my bathrobe, staring at the folded name tag I'd placed beside my cold cup of coffee. The old man funding it all. The words looked harmless printed in ink, but I knew better. Words could reveal the rot beneath a family's polished surface. Margaret would have been furious. I could almost hear her voice in my head, sharp and protective. "You can forgive them once, Thomas, but never twice for the same wound." I picked up the tag and turned it over my hand, tracing the edges until my thumb smudged the lettering. For the first time, I let myself admit something I'd refused to see for years. Maybe they hadn't changed at all. Maybe I'd just been blind. Above the fireplace hung a family portrait taken 5 years earlier, our 40th anniversary. I was seated in the center beside Margaret, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. On one side stood my son David and his wife Claire, and on the other, my grandson Ethan with his sister Mia, both still teenagers back then. We looked like a family, united, happy, but photographs lie. They freeze smiles, not truths. I rose from the table, poured another cup of coffee, and sat back down, staring into the dark swirl of it as memories began to surface. Quiet moments I'd brush aside. The first time David had asked for a little help after Margaret's funeral. He'd invited me to dinner, something he rarely did, and spent the evening reminiscing about her warmth, her cooking, her laughter. It was touching until dessert came. "Dad," he'd said carefully, "Claire and I are thinking about updating the kitchen. Just a few appliances. We're a little tight with tuition coming up for Ethan, but..." I'd stopped him then. "Are you asking me for money?" He'd smiled, that salesman smile of his. "Not asking. Just thought, maybe you want to help the family. And I had $30,000 that night. I told myself it was love, but that night had been the start. Small requests became larger ones. Renovations turned into vacations. Tuition help became new cars. They had been rewriting our family story for years, and I've been financing every chapter. Now, staring at the name tag again, I realized the joke at the wedding hadn't been a joke at all. It was a punchline to a story I'd paid to write. And maybe, finally, it was time I rewrote the ending. By mid-morning, I found myself in the hallway closet, kneeling on the cold tile floor like an archaeologist uncovering a ruin. Stacked shoe boxes, old tax folders, and half-faded bank envelopes surrounded me. I pulled everything out, years of statements, canceled checks, and credit transfer slips, the real history of my so-called generosity. For a long while, I just stared at the numbers. Then I started adding them up. $30,000 for the kitchen renovation, $42,000 for the house expansion, another $15,000 to help with tuition, $10,000 for a car Claire said was for Ethan, but we'll drive it until he graduates. Vacation packages, private school fees, clothing allowances, a family trip to Italy where I'd been invited as a guest but billed as a host. When the totals stacked up in my notebook, my hand went still. $240,000. $250,000. Gone quietly in the name of family. I sat there in silence, my back aching, as guilt tangled with anger inside me. For years, I confused enabling with love. I believed that by giving, I was keeping the peace, holding our fragile family together with money like duct tape on a crack wall. But Margaret had seen this coming. The codicil wasn't protection for the money. It was protection for me. The phone rang, slicing through my thoughts. The caller ID flashed Claire. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Then I picked up. "Dad," she said, her voice syrupy and bright. "We were just talking about how beautiful the wedding was. Ethan and Lily couldn't have done it without you. Really, we can't thank you enough." Her words were polished, smooth, practiced. "Glad they were happy," I said quietly. "Actually," she continued, lowering her tone, "that's partly why I'm calling. See, Lily's parents were supposed to pay for their honeymoon, but her father's business hit a rough patch. Poor thing. She's been crying all morning. They've set their hearts on 2 weeks in Bali, and..." I closed my eyes. "And you're asking me to cover it." A pause. Then, "Well, we'd help too, of course. It's just you've always been so supportive." I could hear laughter in the background. David's voice carefree and oblivious. "I'll think about it," I said finally, surprising even myself. "Oh," she said, her voice tightening. "They'll need to book soon for the best rates." "I understand," I replied, and hung up before she could say another word. The line went dead, leaving only the hum of silence and the open boxes at my feet. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. I felt awake. Margaret's voice whispered in memory. "They'll keep taking Thomas until you remember your table, and you can stop serving." And I realized maybe it was time to stop. A knock at the door broke the silence that had settled over the house. I glanced at the clock. Barely noon. My first thought was that Claire had sent someone over to sweet-talk me into writing another check. But when I peered through the peephole, I saw Mia's younger brother, my grandson Noah, standing on the porch. He was 21 now, tall and broad-shouldered, with that same gentle steadiness his grandmother once had. There was no trace of the smugness I'd come to associate with the rest of them, just nervous energy, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes darting toward the driveway. I opened the door. "Well, if it isn't my favorite book thief," I said with a small smile. He grinned sheepishly. "You still remember that? I was 12. I remember everything that cost me money," I joked, stepping aside. "Come in." He followed me into the kitchen, the faint scent of coffee and old paper still lingering in the air. "You all right, Grandpa?" he asked. "You left the wedding early." Everyone was wondering. "Everyone," I said, raising an eyebrow. "Or just your parents?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Both. But I wanted to check on you myself." That simple sentence hit harder than I expected. No hidden motive, no request, just concern. I'm fine, I said, pouring him some tea. Just tired of parties where laughter feels rehearsed. He nodded, silent for a while. Then he looked up. I wanted to say sorry for what happened. The name tag, the jokes. It wasn't right. I should have said something. I studied him for a moment, the honesty in his eyes. You noticed? Everyone noticed, he said quietly. They laughed because they thought it was harmless. I didn't. Dad and Mom said it was just a bit of fun, but he stopped, jaw tightening. I heard worse later. What do you mean? He glanced toward the living room, then leaned closer. A few nights before the wedding, I overheard Dad talking to Mom about your house. He said it's too big for one person and that they should help you downsize. His words. Help me downsize, I repeated bitterly. He mentioned selling it. Said you'd be better off at that retirement complex near the lake, Sunrise Meadows or something. I felt my throat tighten. They weren't just after handouts anymore. They wanted control. Noah looked guilty. I didn't know if I should tell you. You did right, I said quietly. Margaret would have been proud of you. He blinked. Grandma? I smiled faintly. She saw through people better than I ever could. She'd tell me to stop pretending I don't know what's happening. Noah frowned. So what are you going to do? I looked at the name tag lying on the counter, beside the ledger of payments. I think, I said slowly, it's time I stopped being the man who pays for everything and started being a man they shouldn't have underestimated. Noah grinned. The first real smile of the day. That's the grandpa I remember. And for the first time in years, I almost believed him. 3 days after the wedding, I received a polished email from Claire. Family brunch this Sunday at the Lakeview Country Club. Casual attire. We'd love for you to join us. Dad, everyone's asking about you. I stared at it for a while before replying, I'll be there. Part of me wanted to decline, to spend the day pruning the garden or reading in peace. But curiosity won. I needed to see whether that humiliating old man joke had been an isolated bit of cruelty or part of a pattern that had been building for years. Sunday morning came bright and clear. I put on a cream-colored suit, one Margaret had always had made me look like I still owned the room. It was time to find out whether I did. When I arrived at Lakeview Country Club, the first thing I noticed was how familiar faces turned just a bit too quickly. The second thing was the seating chart. My name placed far from my family at a side table, squeezed between the groom's distant uncle and Lily's aunt. Dad! David called, waving from the head table like a man introducing a celebrity. Over here. Claire stood beside him, dazzling in an ivory dress that probably cost more than my first car. You look wonderful, Thomas, she said sweetly, kissing the air near my cheek. We saved you a special seat. I followed them, my stomach already tightening. The brunch began pleasantly enough, mimosas, laughter, polite chatter. Then Claire stood and clinked her glass. Everyone, she said with a radiant smile, thank you for joining us to celebrate the newlyweds once again. But before we finish, I have a special announcement. David nodded approvingly, clearly and on it. We're thrilled to share, Claire continued, that Grandpa Thomas has decided to gift Ethan and Lily the honeymoon of their dreams. 2 magical weeks in Bali. Applause. Laughter. Cameras flashing. I froze mid-sip, my coffee cup hovering just below my mouth. I hadn't agreed to anything. This is the first I'm hearing of it. I said evenly, my voice cutting through the room like glass. A hush fell. Ethan looked confused, Lily mortified. Well, you said you'd think about it, Claire replied, still smiling but with tension tightening her jaw. So we assumed. I said I'd think, I repeated, not decide. David leaned in, whispering harshly, Dad, don't make a scene. They've already booked the flights. That did it. Something inside me, stretched for years, finally snapped. I don't recall agreeing to fund a trip to Bali, I said clearly. And it's bad manners to spend someone else's money without asking first, don't you think? A ripple of discomfort swept through the tables. Claire's smile cracked. Perhaps, I continued, a more modest honeymoon, one within their means, might be a better idea. Claire hissed, Your means, you mean? Everyone knows Margaret left you more than comfortable. I met her eyes, calm now. My comfort isn't public property. David grabbed my arm, voice low. You're embarrassing us. I pulled my arm free. No, son, you embarrassed yourselves. I stood, smoothing my jacket. Ethan, Lily, congratulations again. I wish you both happiness. We'll talk privately about a proper gift. And with that, I walked out, not the old man funding it all anymore, but the man finally closing the account. That evening, the house felt unusually still, the kind of silence that hums with unfinished business. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot where I'd once signed checks for every family emergency. Now the only thing in front of me was a half-empty cup of coffee and Margaret's letter. The words had been circling in my head all day. When they forget the difference between love and dependence. I hadn't realized just how far that forgetting had gone until this morning's brunch. Seeing David and Claire smiling as they publicly volunteered my wallet had been like watching strangers use my face as decoration in their show. A knock on the back door pulled me from my thoughts. I wasn't surprised to see Noah standing there again, hands shoved into his pockets. He looked uncomfortable, like someone who'd come to deliver bad news. Didn't expect to see you twice in 1 week, I said, opening the door. He shrugged. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Mom and Dad came home arguing. I imagine they did, I said dryly. Did they happen to mention why? They said you humiliated them in front of everyone, he said carefully. Mom said you've been acting irrational. I laughed, a low, humorless sound. That's one word for it. Noah hesitated, then pulled out a chair. Grandpa, what's really going on? You've been different lately. Stronger, I guess. Like you're not scared to push back anymore. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw none of his father's cunning. Just concern, integrity, something worth protecting. So I decided to tell him the truth. There's something your grandmother arranged before she died. I began. Something I didn't know about until the night of the wedding. I took out the folded letter and slid it across the table. He read quietly, eyes widening as he reached the final lines. She wrote this, he asked. She did. Margaret always planned ahead. She wanted to make sure I wasn't taken advantage of once she was gone. He leaned back, exhaling. So if Dad and Mom keep treating you like this, they lose everything. I finished. Are you going to tell them? Not yet. He frowned. Why not? Because fear makes people behave. But truth shows who they really are. He nodded slowly, understanding more than most adults might have. Grandpa, he said softly, whatever happens next, I'm with you. I placed my hand over his, feeling the solid warmth of loyalty, something money couldn't buy. Then maybe, I said, this family still has a chance. Outside, the last light of dusk fell across the kitchen window, painting the room in quiet gold. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Noah and I were still sitting at the table when the headlights swept across the front window. The crunch of tires on gravel came next, sharp, fast, angry. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Your father, I muttered. Noah's jaw tightened. You don't have to open the door, Grandpa. Yes, I said quietly, standing. I do. The doorbell rang twice, short, impatient jabs. I opened it before the third. David stood there, his face red from anger and drink. What the hell was that performance today? He demanded, stepping past me into the hallway without waiting to be invited. He spotted Noah in the kitchen and stopped. You here too? What is this? Some kind of intervention. Noah crossed his arms. Just having dinner with Grandpa. You should try that sometime without asking for money. Don't start, David snapped. Then don't barge into his house yelling. Noah shot back. Both of you sit down, I said sharply, my voice cutting through their argument. I motioned toward the living room, where the fire crackled quietly. David paced like a caged animal. You embarrassed us, Dad. You humiliated Mom in front of Ethan, in front of the Andersons, over a damn honeymoon. I corrected a lie, I said calmly. That's not humiliation, that's truth. You could have talked to us privately, he barked. I've tried that for years, I said, keeping my tone even, but you only listen when there's an audience or a checkbook involved. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression darkening. You've changed. You're letting Noah fill your head with nonsense. No, I said. Noah's just the first person in this family who's treated me with honesty. David's eyes narrowed. You've been poisoning him against us. Noah stood, fists clenched. No one's poisoning me. I've seen the way you and Mom talk about him. About selling this house. About his money. You think no one hears you, but I do. David's face flushed crimson. You've been spying on us? I've been paying attention, Noah said. David turned back to me, shifting into the same rehearsed calm he used when trying to close a business deal. Dad, we're just worried. You're getting older. Maybe you need help managing your finances. We could. Stop, I said, raising a hand. I'm not senile, and I don't need a caretaker. What I need is a son who remembers he had a father before he had a sponsor. His eyes flickered, surprise, then resentment. So what? You're cutting us off. I'm setting boundaries. I replied, you mistaken access for love. That ends tonight. He stared at me for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. This isn't over. No, I said quietly, it isn't, but the rules have changed. He stormed out, the front door slamming behind him. Silence filled the house again, heavy, but cleaner somehow. Noah sank back into his chair. You okay? I nodded slowly. For the first time in a long while, yes. Margaret's letter still sat on the table beside us. I glanced at it, then at my grandson. I said, your grandmother just saw her plan begin. The morning after David's outburst, I woke earlier than usual. Sleep had come in pieces, restless, shallow. The house felt colder somehow, like it was holding its breath. I made a single cup of coffee, stared at it for a minute, then picked up the phone and called Martin Reeves. Thomas, he said, his tone instantly warm. I was hoping you'd call. I had a feeling last night wouldn't end quietly. You'd be right, I said. I think it's time I understood exactly what Margaret left behind, and what that codicil truly covers. I can make time this afternoon, he replied. 1 o'clock. Perfect. By 1. I was sitting across from him in his oak-paneled office, sunlight cutting across the stacks of leather-bound files. He poured us both coffee and opened a folder thick with documents. Margaret was meticulous, he began. She didn't just think about what to leave. She thought about how it would protect you. He explained slowly, clearly. Margaret had owned far more than I realized. Shares in companies she quietly invested in, a trust she'd grown over decades, several pieces of real estate I hadn't even known were in her name. She kept most of it in her own portfolio, Martin said. Her reasoning was simple. She wanted to ensure you'd never depend on anyone's goodwill, not even your own children's. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. I knew she was careful, but not this careful. She was also private, he added with a small smile. She told me once that she'd rather surprise you with stability than burden you with details. I couldn't help but chuckle. That sounds like her. Then his tone grew serious. The codicil is ironclad, Thomas. Any descendant who publicly humiliates or manipulates you forfeits their entire inheritance. That name tag at the wedding, the brunch incident, both qualify under the terms. I stared at the letterhead, the ink, the quiet authority of it all. Margaret's foresight had built an invisible shield, one my children had already shattered without even realizing it. So what now? I asked. That depends on what you want, Martin said. You don't have to enforce it immediately, but you could make some adjustments of your own. What kind of adjustments? New directives, he said. A revised will that reflects your judgment. You could reward integrity, Noah, for example, while excluding those who've proven themselves undeserving. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I smiled faintly. Martin, I said, I think Margaret and I might finally be on the same page. He returned the smile, understanding completely. Quiet justice, then? Exactly. As I left his office, the autumn wind tugged at my coat. The city around me bustled, unaware that somewhere above the noise, a man long dismissed as the old one paying for everything was finally reclaiming every penny of dignity they'd stolen. That night, I poured myself a glass of scotch and raised it toward Margaret's photo on the mantel. "You plan for everything," I whispered. "Now it's my turn." For the first time in years, I woke up without dread. No calls from David. No guilt tugging me toward the checkbook. Just quiet, real peaceful quiet. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper through it. "Start living again, Thomas. You've given enough." So that's what I decided to do. That morning, I went through my phone contacts, a graveyard of names I hadn't called since before Margaret passed. At the top of the list was Eleanor Price, one of Margaret's closest friends. I hadn't seen her in nearly 3 years. When she answered, her voice carried the same gentle humor I remembered. "Thomas Hall, I thought you'd vanished into early retirement." "Maybe I did," I said, "but I'm trying to find my way back out." We met for lunch the next day at a quiet bistro near the marina. The moment she saw me, Eleanor smiled and said, "You look like a man who's just remembered he has a spine." I laughed, a real, honest laugh. It's been a while since anyone's accused me of that. We talked for hours. About Margaret, about the loneliness that had filled the house like fog, about art classes she'd started taking at the community center. Before we parted, she pressed a flyer into my hand. "You should try one of these," she said. "Painting, photography, even woodworking. Something to remind you life isn't done giving you colors." That evening, I stared at the flyer for a long time. Margaret had always encouraged me to pick up a brush, but I'd never done it. Maybe it was time. The next morning, I enrolled in a beginner's painting class. Just another name on the roster, no titles, no old man paying for everything. At the same time, I began untangling my finances. I closed a joint account David had access to, redirected my investments into a private trust, and set up a separate account for something new, the Hall Foundation, a quiet fund dedicated to supporting local small businesses and education programs. It wasn't about revenge. It was about redirection. If my family didn't value generosity, others would. That week, I ignored every call from Claire and every text from David. Their silence soon followed, an unspoken stalemate I welcomed. Instead, my evenings filled with new things. The smell of oil paint, the chatter of strangers who didn't know me as anyone's father or wallet, and the strange comfort of possibility. And once a week, Noah stopped by. We'd share dinner, talk about his future, the bookstore he wanted to open one day, the kind of place Margaret would have loved. Each time he left, I felt something return, a sense of purpose that money had long buried. By the end of that month, I realized something simple and profound. I didn't need to buy respect. I just needed to stop renting my dignity. And for the first time in years, I felt like Thomas Hall again. Not the financier of other people's dreams, but the quiet architect of his own. It didn't take long for the silence to break. 3 months after the brunch, the phone began ringing again, not daily, but in strategic bursts. First it was Claire, then David, then both, always with the same sing-song tone of concern that barely hid the desperation underneath. "Dad, we've been worried about you," Claire said one evening, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You've been so quiet lately. We were thinking maybe a nice family dinner could clear the air. Translation, we need something." I told her I was busy. 2 days later, a text from David. "Just checking in. By the way, remember that investment opportunity one mentioned a while back? I think you'd really like it." I didn't reply. When subtlety failed, they moved to guilt. Claire left a long voicemail, her tone trembling with rehearsed emotion. "Thomas, you've always been the heart of this family. The kids miss you. Ethan's been talking about how much your support meant to him at the wedding. You don't want distance to ruin what Margaret built, do you?" What Margaret built. The irony was almost painful. I didn't delete the voicemail. I saved it, a reminder of how manipulation often came disguised as love. Meanwhile, my world was growing, brighter, fuller. The community art classes had become my sanctuary. I wasn't good, not yet, but I enjoyed every brushstroke. There was something liberating about creating something just for myself. Eleanor often joined me after class for coffee. "You look lighter these days," she said once, studying me with an artist's eye. "Maybe I finally learned the price of peace," I replied. But peace had its price indeed, and my family wasn't ready to pay it. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Elegant stationery. David's handwriting. Inside was a detailed proposal, complete with cost estimates, for remodeling their backyard to include a family pool and outdoor entertainment area, which of course they believed you and Mom would have loved to enjoy with us. I laughed aloud, not out of joy but disbelief. At the bottom, in Claire's neat cursive, was a postscript. It would mean the world to Ethan and Mia. "They deserve nice things, Dad." For years that line, "they deserve nice things," had been my Achilles heel. But now I saw it for what it was, a leash disguised as affection. That night, I drafted my own letter, short, calm, final. "David, I love you, but I will no longer be financing your lifestyle. What I give from now on will be earned through respect, not expectation. Dad." No threats, no anger, just truth. 2 days later, I receive a reply, not from David, but from Claire. "You'll regret this." Maybe, but as I looked out at my blooming garden, the air alive with the smell of fresh paint from my studio window, I doubted it, because for the first time in decades, I was no longer afraid of losing their approval. I had already found something far better, myself. My 69th birthday arrived quietly, no fanfare, no noise. I hadn't planned to celebrate at all, but Noah had other ideas. "Just a small dinner, Grandpa," he'd said, grinning as he arranged plates on my dining table. "Family only. No surprises, I promise." I should have known better. By evening, the house smelled of roast chicken and rosemary. Candles flickered softly, casting warm light across the table. I dressed in a new navy shirt, freshly pressed. For once, I felt proud of how my home looked. Simple, uncluttered, peaceful. At 5 sharp, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath before opening it. There they were, David and Claire, smiling as if the past months hadn't happened. Claire held a bouquet of supermarket flowers. David carried a bottle of wine. Their smiles looked brittle, stretched too far. "Happy birthday, Dad," David said, stepping forward to hug me. His arms were stiff, formal. "Thank you," I replied evenly. "Come in." They entered, eyes scanning the living room like realtors assessing property. "New painting?" Claire asked, gesturing toward a landscape I'd finished last week. "Yes," I said. "One of mine." Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh, you're selling your paintings now." "I sold 2 at the community art fair," I replied. "Not bad for an old man, hmm?" She gave a tight smile, clearly confused by the idea that I might have found purpose beyond their approval. Soon Ethan and Lily arrived, followed by Noah carrying a cake. The house filled with conversation. Polite, hollow words bouncing off walls thick with history. After dinner, as I began slicing the cake, David cleared his throat. "Before we do dessert," he said, "Claire and I want to discuss something important. Family business." I set down the knife. "Go on." Claire clasped her hands, her tone sugar-sweet. "We've been worried about you, Thomas. You've been different, distant, and some of the decisions you've made lately, closing accounts, funding Noah's bookstore idea, they concern us." The air shifted. "You're saying I'm not capable of making my own choices?" David spoke up, rehearsed and calm. "We just think you need a little help managing things. Maybe a power of attorney setup, so we can protect your assets in case." "In case I stop paying your bills?" I interrupted. The room froze. Claire's face flushed. David's mask slipped. "Dad," he hissed, "don't twist this. We're trying to help." "No," I said, rising slowly. "You're trying to control." Across the table, Noah sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. Ethan looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Martin Reeves, who'd arrived quietly as a guest and dear old friend, set down his coffee cup. "That's a serious suggestion, David," he said calmly. "Are you implying your father's incompetent?" David glared. I'm saying he's being manipulated. Martin smiled faintly. By whom? The grandson who spends time with him without asking for a check. David said nothing. I looked around the table, at the family I built, fractured, financed, and forgiven too many times. I've spent years mistaking money for love, I said quietly. But tonight, I see the truth. I raise investors, not children. Claire rose abruptly. You can't talk to us like that. I can, I said, and I just did. The silence that followed was deep and electric. The sound of family finally stripped bare. In that moment, Margaret's words echoed through me once more. When they show you who they are, Thomas, stop paying the admission fee. I looked at Noah and gave a faint nod. He understood. The reckoning had begun. For a long moment, the air hung thick, the kind of silence that makes every heartbeat feel like a hammer. Claire stood frozen mid-protest, David glaring, Noah tense beside me. Then Martin Reeves slowly rose from his chair. Perhaps, he said, his voice calm and measured, this would be a good time to clarify a few things. David's eyes narrowed. Clarify what? Martin reached into his briefcase, drew out a cream-colored envelope, and set it gently on the table. The sight of it made my pulse quicken, the same envelope Margaret had written years ago. This, Martin said, is a codicil to your late mother's will. She added it shortly before she passed, with instructions for me to disclose its contents if she believed Thomas was being mistreated or manipulated by family. Claire frowned. What are you talking about? Mom's will was settled ages ago. This isn't part of the original estate, Martin explained. It's a separate provision, one she called her final safeguard. He glanced toward me, silently asking permission. I nodded. Martin unfolded the document, his tone crisp and steady as he read aloud. In the event that any descendant of mine publicly humiliates, coerces, or exploits my husband, Thomas Hall, for personal or financial gain, that descendant shall forfeit all inheritance rights to the Hall estate. The room went deathly still. Martin continued. Such acts include, but are not limited to, mocking or demeaning him publicly, attempting to control his finances without consent, or treating him as a financial resource rather than a family member. He lowered the paper. Mrs. Hall's wording is, as always, quite specific. David's face turned white. You can't be serious. Completely, Martin replied. I've documented recent incidents, including the name tag of the wedding, the unauthorized announcement of the Bali honeymoon, and this evening's attempt to obtain power of attorney under false pretense. These qualify under the codicil's terms. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. You're twisting everything. Margaret would never cut her own son out. She didn't, Martin said evenly. You did. I stayed silent, watching them unravel. David slammed his fist against the table. This is a setup. Martin didn't flinch. It's a safeguard. Your mother knew generosity could be mistaken for weakness. She prepared for this exact moment. Noah looked stunned. Ethan stared at his plate, and Claire's eyes darted between us like a trapped animal searching for an exit. So that's it, David demanded. We lose everything? I finally spoke, my voice quiet but unshakable. You don't lose everything, David. You lose what you never earned. He shook his head, disbelief turning to anger. You'd let this lawyer ruin your family? I met his gaze. You already did. For a moment, no one moved. Then Martin folded the codicil and slipped it back into the envelope. The decision to enforce it, he said, rests with Thomas. All eyes turned to me. I looked around the table at my broken son, his bitter wife, my silent grandchildren, and the young man who had stood beside me when no one else did. Yes, I said finally. I'll enforce it. Claire gasped. David sank into his chair, speechless. Noah reached over, steadying my trembling hand. And just like that, Margaret's final act of love became my first act of freedom. For a moment after I spoke the words, the world seemed to stop. You could have heard the tick of the kitchen clock a room away. Then Claire's voice sliced through the silence. You can't do this, Thomas, she cried, her mask of charm dissolving into raw panic. We're your family. Exactly, I said quietly, which makes this the hardest thing I've ever done. David pushed back on the table so violently that his chair toppled over. You think you can humiliate me like this? In front of everyone. I'm not humiliating you, I said. I'm holding you accountable. He pointed an accusing finger at Martin. You! This is manipulation. Dad's being tricked by a lawyer and a college kid who doesn't know anything about... Stop, I interrupted. Don't drag Noah into this. He's the only one who's treated me like a person, not a transaction. Noah stayed silent beside me, jaw tight but calm. Claire crossed her arms, voice sharp. So, what? We're cut out completely? After everything we've done for you? I turned toward her. Claire, everything you've done for me came with an invoice attached. She flinched, lips trembling with rage. This isn't over. No, I said softly. It is? David slammed his hands on the table. You'll regret this, Dad. When you're old and alone, don't come begging us to visit. I'd rather be alone, I said, than surrounded by people who only come for the leftovers. The words seemed to suck the air from the room. Martin gathered the papers quietly. The codicil will take effect immediately, he said. You'll receive written confirmation within the week. As executor, I'll ensure the transfers are handled privately. David let out a bitter laugh. So you win. You get everything, don't you, Dad? I shook my head. No, David, I don't get everything. I keep what your mother built for me. You and Claire forfeited it. Ethan, who'd been silent the whole time, finally spoke. Grandpa, I didn't know any of this. I swear, I should have said something about the name tag. I looked at him, my grandson nervous, ashamed, young enough to learn. Then say something now, I said gently. He nodded slowly. I'm sorry. That was all I needed. I reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. Then we start over. You and I. David stared at me, eyes glassy with fury and disbelief. Then he turned, grabbed Claire's arm, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the frame. The room was still again. The storm had passed, but the wreckage remained. Silent plates, half-eaten cake, and the faint smell of extinguished candles. Noah let out a breath he'd been holding. You okay, Grandpa? I sank back into my chair, exhausted but strangely weightless. Better than I've been in years. Martin placed a hand on my shoulder. She'd be proud of you, Thomas. I looked at the folded letter still sitting by my plate. Margaret's handwriting, her foresight, her love. She already was. I said, I just had to catch up. Outside, the night wind carried away the last of the shouting, leaving only the whisper of freedom. And for the first time in decades, my house didn't feel heavy. It felt like mine. The weeks after the confrontation passed quietly, like the calm that settles after a long, violent storm. The silence in my house was no longer heavy. It was cleansing. For the first time in years, there were no guilt-laden phone calls, no veiled requests for a little help. My phone still rang sometimes, but the caller ID told the whole story. David. Claire. Declined. They didn't stop trying right away, of course. At first came the angry texts. You've let that lawyer brainwash you. Mom would be disgusted with what you've done. Then the guilt trips. We're struggling, Dad. We might have to sell the house. Is that what you want? And when those didn't work, the last message arrived like a quiet confession. Fine. You've made your choice. Yes, I had. After that, nothing. Silence. But this time it was peaceful. Meanwhile, life moved forward in small, beautiful ways. Noah spent most evenings with me, helping fix up the old shed behind the house. He decided to turn it into a mock storefront, a testing ground for his future bookstore. The boy had vision, and Margaret would have adored his stubborn optimism. Ethan stopped by occasionally, too, humbled and careful in his words. I didn't understand before, he admitted one afternoon as we painted shelves together. Dad always made it sound like you owed him. I see now how wrong that was. I nodded. We all learn at our own cost, Ethan. The important part is your learning. He smiled, a genuine one, the kind that felt like forgiveness. Even the house began to change. I repainted the living room in soft amber tones. Hung my own paintings where family portraits once stood. It felt less like a museum of memories and more like a home again. Every Sunday, Eleanor joined us for dinner. She brought laughter and warmth back into these walls. One evening, as we sat by the fire, she said, "You don't seem like a man who lost a family, Thomas. You seem like a man who found a real one." Maybe she was right. I didn't lose a family that night at my birthday dinner. I shed a burden, and what remained was something worth keeping. Noah's steady loyalty, Ethan's quiet remorse, and the ghost of Margaret's wisdom still guiding every step I took. For years, I thought legacy was measured in what we leave behind. But sitting in that newly brightened house, I realized something truer. Legacy isn't what we leave to people. It's what we leave in them. And finally, I was leaving something worth inheriting. Spring came early that year. The air smelled of rain and renewal, and the cherry trees along the street outside my house bloomed in bursts of pale pink. Quiet reminders that life, no matter how bruised, keeps finding ways to begin again. Noah's bookstore was almost ready. He'd found an old Victorian building downtown, the kind with creaking floors, high windows, and the faint scent of history clinging to the wood. When he first showed it to me, it looked like a lost cause. Peeling paint, broken shelves, a roof that leaked like a sieve. But Noah had Margaret's stubbornness, that same fire that refused to die when the odds said it should. He called it Chapter 1. It was the perfect name. I quietly helped with some of the startup costs, but not as a benefactor this time. As an investor, we'd drawn up the papers together, line by line. I told him, "If you want me involved, treat me like a partner, not a piggy bank." He smiled and agreed without hesitation. The renovation took months. I stopped by every week just to see the progress. I helped paint walls, carry boxes, even assemble furniture. It reminded me of when Margaret and I first built our home. Every nail and brushstroke felt like a promise. By late May, the store stood transformed. The floors gleamed, shelves lined the walls, and in the center stood a hand-carved wooden counter that Noah and I had built together. The smell of fresh books filled the air, ink, paper, and something softer. Hope. The grand opening drew a small crowd. Friends, neighbors, a few curious passers-by. Eleanor brought pastries. Ethan helped at the register, and Noah stood beside me at the entrance, a proud grin stretching across his face. "You did this," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "We did this." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. Grandma would have loved to hear. "I think she's already here," I said, my throat tightening. She was always good at turning dreams into rooms you could walk through. When the ribbon was cut, applause filled the air. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the man paying for everything. I felt like someone investing in a future worth believing in. As the evening settled, I stood by the door, watching people browse the shelves, laughter spilling softly between the aisles. This, not the inheritance, not the estate. This was my legacy. A place built on respect, not expectation. On love freely given, not bought. Margaret's codicil had protected our fortune. But Noah's bookstore, that protected our name. And in that small, light-filled shop, I realized something I'd almost forgotten. Life doesn't end when people leave you. Sometimes, it begins the moment you let them go. A full year passed before I saw either of them again. Life had filled itself beautifully in their absence. My days were slower now, but fuller. Morning walks to the corner cafe, afternoons at Chapter 1. Evenings shared with Eleanor and the small circle of friends I'd made at the art center. I'd sold 3 more paintings that spring. Not for the money, for the feeling. Creating something that people wanted to take home, because it made them feel something. That was a kind of wealth I'd never known when I was busy writing checks to buy affection. Noah's bookstore was thriving. On weekends, it became a gathering place for readers, students, and even parents who brought their children to Story Hour with Grandpa Thomas. I didn't plan that name. Noah came up with it. But hearing little kids call me, that filled a space in my heart that family once emptied. Then, one quiet Sunday afternoon, the past came knocking. Literally. The sound startled me. 3 slow knocks on the front door. When I opened it, I froze. David stood there. But not the David I remembered. Not the polished man in tailored suits and confident smirks. This version looked smaller. His clothes hung loose, his hair unkempt, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. Behind him, Claire sat in the car, staring straight ahead. "Dad," he said finally, voice low, "can we talk?" I stepped aside without a word. He entered hesitantly, looking around the house. At the new paintings, the rearranged furniture, the warmth that no longer came from him. "It looks different," he murmured. "Happier." I said nothing. He sighed. "Things haven't been easy. The business deal I was working on fell through. We had to sell the house. We're renting now." I nodded slowly. "I'm sorry to hear that." He hesitated. "I know you probably don't care." "Of course I care," I said gently. "You're still my son. But caring doesn't mean rescuing anymore." He looked down, ashamed. I deserved that. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy with everything we hadn't said in years. Then quietly he asked, "Did Mom know we'd end up like this?" "She didn't want this," I said softly. "She wanted better from us. She just knew what could happen if we forgot the difference between love and greed." He nodded, eyes glassy. I did forget. For the first time in decades, my son didn't look like a man performing. He looked like a boy again, lost, remorseful, searching for a way back. "I'm not asking for money," he said finally. "I just wanted to see you." That, more than any apology, reached me. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You just did." He nodded, turned to leave, then stopped. "Noah's store? I went by last week. It's beautiful. You both did good." I smiled faintly. "We did." He left without another word. The sound of his car faded down the road, leaving only the soft ticking of the clock in the hall. For a long while, I stood by the door, watching the empty street. There were no fireworks in that moment, no perfect reconciliation, just quiet truth, and maybe, finally, the star of forgiveness. Margaret once told me, "Sometimes, Thomas, grace looks less like a second chance and more like letting people face their own ending." That afternoon, I understood what she meant. Autumn returned before I realized how quickly the seasons had been moving. A year ago, my home had been filled with tension and polite deceit. Now it was full of warmth, the faint smell of turpentine and coffee, and the sound of people who came not to take, but simply to be near. Noah's bookstore had become the heart of the town. On Saturdays, the bell above the door never stopped ringing. I'd watch him from my corner seat. Sleeves rolled up, laughing easily with customers. The same spark in his eyes that Margaret once had when she found joy in simple things. He'd turned that store into something more than a business. It was a place for people to gather, to learn, to share stories, a small rebellion against the selfishness that had once defined our family. Sometimes Ethan came too, helping with weekend readings or carrying boxes of donated books. He'd grown quieter, humbler. I could see him trying to rebuild the bridge his parents had burned, step by careful step, and I welcomed it. Forgiveness, I'd learned, doesn't erase the past. It just stops it from poisoning the future. At home, the walls looked brighter, not from fresh paint, but from peace. The silence that had once haunted me now felt alive, filled with the echoes of laughter and the faint hum of contentment. Eleanor often teased me about how domestic I'd become. "You've gone soft, Thomas Hall," she'd laugh as she arranged flowers on my table. "Maybe," I'd say, smiling, "or maybe I just stopped hardening myself for people who never softened for me." We'd sit together, her hand brushing mine occasionally, and I'd feel something tender, a companionship that wasn't built on obligation or old guilt. And sometimes, late at night, I'd talk to Margaret. Her photo still sat on the mantel, smiling as though she'd known all along how this would unfold. "You were right," I'd tell her softly. "They learned, even if it took losing everything to do it. And I learned, too, that money was never the legacy you wanted us to protect. It was dignity. It was kindness. It was truth." Outside, the wind would stir the garden she once tended, and I could almost hear her voice in it. Proud, amused, loving. I wasn't the same man who once mistook giving for being loved. I'd rebuilt from the ruins of that version of myself. Brick by brick, brushstroke by brushstroke, kindness by kindness. And in the quiet of those evenings, surrounded by people who cared without counting, I understood something I'd never been wise enough to before. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shares your growth. And mine had finally begun to grow again. Winter arrived quietly that year. The first snowfall came one morning while I was sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the world turn white. Everything outside looked soft again. Clean, untouched, new. It had been nearly 2 years since the wedding. The day my name tag called me the old man funding everything. I smiled at the memory now. Once, that label would have stung. Now, it only reminded me how far I'd come. That afternoon, I went to chapter 1. The bell over the door chimed as I stepped inside, and warmth wrapped around me. The smell of old paper, roasted coffee, and the quiet murmur of people reading. Noah was behind the counter, helping a young couple pick out books for their daughter. He looked up, spotted me, and grinned. "Grandpa, you're just in time. Story hour starts in 10. He handed me a worn copy of The Wind in the Willows. I laughed softly. "Still making me read the classics, huh?" "Tradition," he said with a wink. The small crowd gathered. Children on a rug, parents sipping coffee, Eleanor arranging chairs. Ethan was there too, handing out cookies, his face open and kind. Every so often, our eyes met, and we shared the quiet understanding of two people who'd seen a family break and somehow rebuild itself from the gentler pieces that remained. When I began to read, the children leaned close, eyes wide. Their laughter filled the shop, soft and alive. Somewhere in the back, I could almost feel Margaret watching, not from sorrow, but from pride. Afterward, as people lingered, Noah came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Grandpa," he said, voice low, "I was thinking of putting a small plaque near the entrance. Something simple to honor you and Grandma." He handed me a brass plate. The engraving read, "For Thomas and Margaret Hall, who taught us that love, like books, is best shared freely." My throat tightened. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I smiled. She'd love that. Eleanor slipped her arm through mine. She already does. We stood together, watching as Noah mounted the plaque on the wall beside the door. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the brass, making it glow softly, almost like a heartbeat. I realized then that Margaret's plan, her codicil, her faith, her stubborn love, had led us all here, not to wealth or comfort, but to truth. In the end, she hadn't just protected me from losing my fortune. She protected me from losing myself. And as the laughter of children echoed through that little bookstore, our bookstore, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. The kind of peace that only comes when you've spent your life learning what truly matters. I looked around one last time. At Noah, at Ethan, at Eleanor, at the life still blooming from everything once broken, and I whispered under my breath, "Thank you, Margaret. You finished our story beautifully." Then, as the snow kept falling outside, I closed the book, smiling, and said softly, "The end."